Hi, SLPs. My name is Meredith Harold. I'm the owner of the Informed SLP and newly Informed Jobs as well. And I'm here to talk to you today about getting paid well and understanding your contracts, understanding wage norms, and making sure that you're being paid fairly and what you want to be paid as an SLP. A brief background. I'm a former school-based SLP. I worked as a university professor for some years. I've worked at private practices. I've had my own private practice. And then I started the Informed SLP in 2016. And that's what I've been doing basically ever since then. We just recently this year, right now it's May 2025, in January of 2025, we launched a jobs database alongside the Informed SLP because as an employer of SLPs for so many years, because our entire team at the Informed SLP is all SLPs, I was starting to get really frustrated with what I was seeing happening on the job market for our colleagues and how things like pay transparency and details in job posts just weren't happening. And I decided that we could do it better, that Indeed wasn't solving any of our, problems as SLPs while on the job market. LinkedIn wasn't solving it, but that if we made a jobs database specifically for SLPs that essentially protected SLPs and got us the information we needed to know when we're on the job market, that it would therefore make it easier for SLPs to find good, fair, ethical job fits. And so in this process of launching our jobs database through the Informed SLP, one of the things that we quickly realized, me and the other team members, was that SLPs don't actually understand their contracts nor how much they're really being paid, which kind of sounds crazy, right? Like, how can we possibly not know what we're being paid? But even we didn't, with as much research that we had done, as much partnering we had done with, HR teams and whatnot. And so this lecture is basically everything that if I had an hour to tell you and teach you some of the things that me and my team have learned over the last 6+ months about SLP wages, these would be the things that I would tell you in order to ensure that you're actually getting paid appropriately and understand your wages and contract. So let's get right into it. And I promise you, you will learn something. All right. So first question, do we know how much we're making? And that kind of almost sounds offensive, right? Like, of course we know how much we're making. I'm on a contract for $55 an hour. I'm on a contract for $60 per hour. But the answer to this, I would say for most SLPs is actually no. Many SLPs have no idea how much they're making because of the way our contracts are set up and because of some sort of like norms that we've accepted over time. And so I would encourage you to consider the fact that most SLPs have no idea how much money they're making. And I'll show you how and why. So this is what job posts tend to look like. And I'm going to make my face smaller so that it's not in the way. Okay. So look at these two jobs, job A and job B. And you can pause the video right now if you want to, because what I want you to do is by briefly looking at these, or maybe take 5 minutes or take 10 minutes to look at them, which job pays more? And you'll notice I use Kansas City as an example throughout this entire lecture, partly because I live in Kansas City, so it's convenient and comfortable for me, but also because Kansas City has a very average cost of living, which will make all of the numbers feel, roughly average nationwide. But look at these two jobs. Take your time if you need to. Like I said, pause the video. Which job pays more? Now, I removed the hard stuff, okay? Because sometimes you need additional details regarding the health insurance, regarding the details of the 401k plan, because obviously different 401k plans, different retirement plans can have different match amounts. And so therefore they have different values and stuff like that. But even if I strip away all the details, which job pays more? A full-time job that's paying you $75,000 a year or a full-time job that pays you $50 per hour? And I want you to pay attention to what your gut tells you first, then attempt to do the math and see which job pays more. And what I find over time is that most SLPs' gut reaction is that job B pays more. They just feel like job A, while it's a good salary, it's not like an incredible salary, but $50 per hour tends to seem good to them for some reason. And maybe you're the other way around. But go ahead and try and run the math next. So if you run the math, and if both of these jobs are full time, $75,000 per year is going to be paying you 36 per hour, okay? And $50 per hour is going to be paying you $104,000 per year. Now, the math used to get to both of these is kind of this like magic number that you'll see, and I'll teach you how it's threaded through all the jobs database, all HR, all contracts, and that number is 2080. So 2080 is the number that every single jobs database and HR department will use in order to convert between hourly and annual. And 2080 is the number of hours you're going to work in a year if you're working full-time 40 hours per week, year round. Now, that 2080 number doesn't account for little details like it doesn't bring in your PTO. It doesn't bring in the exact number of holidays, and it doesn't account for individual variability for a reason, because there will be some amount of individual variability with the actual number of hours that each person works per year. But that standard 2080 number is a really easy way where if you don't know the exact holidays, the exact PTO, and you don't have good data on other like days and time off and like amount of over versus under work and all that type of stuff, it's a good way to move back and forth between those two numbers. That is between hourly and annual. So what stands out most to SLPs first is $75,000 a year tends to feel normal to them, but $36 an hour feels like disgusting. And we'll see this all the time on social media where an employer will say, come work with us for $38 an hour, and it'll turn into a massive dumpster fire. And everybody's like, that's gross, that's gross, that's gross. We would never work for that. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, these people are holding jobs working exactly for that because they don't realize that's what they're being paid. And then the other reaction that we tend to get from these numbers is the $50 per hour. Everybody is like, no. A $50 per hour SLP job doesn't make over six figures. And they're right. The vast majority of $50 per hour SLP jobs do not make over six figures. Instead, they tend to be very variable. So with job A, the thing about job A is when you're given an annual salary amount and you know how many hours you're going to be working per week and you know how many weeks you're going to be working out of the year, you can very easily calculate between the annual salary and hourly because it's explicitly stated. It's explicitly stated usually in the job post and sometimes even with additional follow-up information questions from the employer as well. But what we all know as SLPs, because we know how our jobs end up playing out, is that $50 per hour isn't over six figures. But I don't think the reality of the range that it actually could be really has set in for our field enough. And that's one of the goals I have for you all tonight, is to recognize that technically a $50 per hour job for an SLP, first of all, usually it's not actually $50 per hour. It's $50 per visit or, direct time only. We'll get more into that later in this lecture. But a $50 per hour job, as you'll see listed online, can be anything between about $40,000 and $104,000. Now, that is a huge range, okay? And two things I want to drive home. That range is gigantic. And a lot of us think we're about to take an $80,000 a year job and it's actually a $60,000 a year job. So from the moment we sign a contract and when we're on the job market, we're often missing out on opportunities to make sure that we're getting the pay that we need or we're hoping for, because we can't run calculations from the information that's given to us. And so we just have to make assumptions. And so we make assumptions based on kind of vibes and how something feels rather than running math on it, because we can't run the math on it. I'll talk to you more about that later in this lecture. And we end up leaving thousands of dollars, if not tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes $20,000, $30,000 on the table because we don't understand our contracts from day one. And then we also don't stay on top of calculating what we're actually making while we hold the job. And I know this is true because I see it on SLP social media all the time and the feedback that people give each other and the questions that are constantly missing from these conversations. Where, like, for example, an SLP will post on Reddit and say, I can't afford to have this job. I don't know how you all are paying your bills. And then people will start to ask them questions and they'll say, like, oh, do you have kids or other family members you're providing for? And the person will be like, no, I'm single. And they'll say, well, what city do you live in? And they'll name a relatively mid or low cost of living city. And then people will be like, well, is your rent really high? Like, do you have like some other bills you're paying? And the person will be like, no, 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 no. And they'll be like, well, how much are you making in your job? And the SLP will say $50 per hour. And then other SLPs will say, well, that's what I make. And maybe you just need to budget better. And so it turns into these really awkward conversations where a lot of people in our field can't figure out what's going wrong. And what's going wrong is that we aren't paying close enough attention to what we're actually being paid, both what we personally are being paid and also in how we advise each other about our jobs. Now, is this our fault? No. I think that all of this has kind of happened over time because employers see an opportunity to cut corners and, shave money off what they pay us and make sure that, they're getting as much out of us as possible for as little as possible. So we didn't cause this. However, we as SLPs are also the only ones that are going to be able to fix it by paying closer attention to it. So, the reality is, job A has a very tight range in what you actually are going to make. In fact, I probably should have made this graph even tighter because it explicitly says in the job post what you're going to make, right? But when we see SLP job posts for something like $50 per hour or $60 per hour, there is a huge range in what that could actually pay us. And more often than not, when jobs are listed as hourly, they tend to pay less than jobs where the pay is more explicit up front. Not always, not across the board, but on average. All right, so let's look at some myths. So one myth is that SLP job posts will tell you how much you'll make per year, but most don't. I finished my master's in 2008. I stayed to get my PhD, so I actually didn't leave the university until 2011. But in 2011, when I was on the job market taking my first SLP job, nobody was talking to us about hourly pay. Nobody was talking to us about pay per visit. Most of our SLP jobs at that time were still paying salary in general, but I've seen more and more over time, more of our jobs switch to an hourly or pay per visit model, and more of our jobs switching from W-2 to 1099. And what that has done is introduced a lot of confusion without very much guidance from anyone. And it's created an environment where we can't read our own job posts very well unless we deeply understand how to run calculations about what we're going to be making. And generally, how much we're paid just isn't in job posts. Like, if we're lucky, they'll tell you a number, right? Whether it's hourly or annual. But pay transparency laws aren't nationwide. Only some states have pay transparency laws. So what you end up seeing is some employers will include pay, but even if they say an amount per hour, they won't be clear enough for you to actually calculate how much you're going to be making per month or per year. So it's kind of like a vanity metric, like they may as well not put it in the job post at all, And it takes a lot of reading between the lines or knowledge about this topic, which you're getting tonight, don't worry, or today, depending on what time you're watching this. And then other employers don't put it in there at all. And so it ends up just making it really difficult for SLPs to have any idea what we're going to be paid. And that's obviously one of the main things that we're looking at when we're choosing jobs. Another myth is that SLP pay is bad. However, it's only bad if you're taking bad jobs. The reality is that SLPs are in over the 80th percentile of earners in the US. So we make more money than 80% of the adults in the United States. Granted, we're not in the top 10%. We're not, attorneys, we're not anesthesiologists, but SLPs make good wages. And they make in particular good wages when they're SLPs who know how to avoid taking jobs that aren't good wages. So we'll teach you how to do that. Another myth is that I can find average SLP pay rates by Googling how much SLPs make, or even like getting into one of the like AI models like ChatGPT or Claude. If you're a fan of Claude, I'm a big Claude fan right now, or some other AI. However, this doesn't work at all. One of the main reasons SLPs continue to be really confused about how much we make, and one of the main reasons why a super common question you'll see on like Facebook and Reddit is Instagram is like, hey, is this pay normal? How much should I be making? What can I expect in this state? What can I expect in this setting? Is because we intuitively know that we don't have good information online about our wages, but we don't know why. And I'll describe to you why. All right, so enough build up. So these are the things that we're going to cover together. Contracts, 1099 versus W-2, pay norms, pay calculations, and where we can kind of go in the future with all of this. So step one is, what do SLP contracts look like? And I'll say this multiple times throughout this lecture. If you're a seasoned SLP and you've been in the field 5 years, 10 years, and you think to yourself, I understand contracts. Like, you don't need to teach me about contracts. I've signed a million of them. I know what I'm doing. I would highly encourage you to actually pay attention to every single detail of this, because a lot of this information did not sink in for me or my staff, all of us who've worked as SLPs for many years, until we were actively running calculations on contracts daily as part of our jobs database. And once we were running the calculations daily, it just made a lot of details way more obvious to us. And I want to pass that information to you, because I genuinely think that a solid 80% of SLPs don't understand this, and it's really important to understand. Okay, so I created this little graphic to make sense of it. And these are the types of contracts SLPs can have. So at the top, we have what most people think they're going to be getting out of a contract. Like when undergrads and grad students like start to get into the field, this is how they tend to think about pay. They think about pay as per year. How much will I be making per year? And this is historically how most of our contracts were looked, and but currently we tend to kind of be moving away from that as a field. So that would be salary or an annual flat rate, where you make something like $70,000 per year. Okay. The next type of contract is an hourly contract. And hourly contracts can either be stable or variable, where what you're paid is $50 per hour. However, what I mean by stable and variable is the degree to which, if you show up to work and plan to work and are available to work, the degree to which you actually can plan on making $50 per hour. So there is a big difference between a job where you take a full-time job and they tell you they have 40 hours per week and that you'll be paid $50 per hour, and you actually get that most of the time, versus jobs where you are taking a full-time job, but you could be paid as little as 20 hours per week. Okay. So the degree to which your pay is either stable or variable is an important factor within hourly contracts. All right. Then the third contract type that's becoming increasingly common, and quick side note, common for many reasons. A lot of times SLPs want to kind of put the blame on employers for increasing the likelihood of these contracts to occur, which obviously it is the employers choosing how to pay SLPs. This is true, but a lot of them are choosing to pay SLPs this way because of declining reimbursement rates. So it's not like an evil, greedy employer type thing who's trying to make this hard and confusing on us all. Instead, it's employers responding to other external barriers and factors that are causing them to have to shift contract types over time, right? However, I believe very strongly that it doesn't matter why the contracts are written that way. And it doesn't matter if an individual SLP or employer thinks it's good or bad, fair or not fair. And in fact, I have no problem personally with any of these contract types. I think they're all good. But the point I always want to make is that the thing that's fair to SLPs is simply for them to understand the contract types, okay? And this is the one that people tend to understand the least and have the most difficulty with predicting. So that would be these per session or per visit contracts. So I tend to refer to these as pay per visit contracts, because that's like the lingo that SLPs use most. But what that means is that you're only paid when you're in direct contact with the client. So, like if you're at a private practice and you're paid $50 per visit, when the client shows up and you're working with them, you're paid $50. However, there's all this other time that you might not be paid for, and that would be all the indirect time, like report writing, sending emails, preparing for the session, any of that type of stuff. Some workplaces will want you to do like other admin work, like scheduling and stuff like that. That kind of varies and depends. But regardless, you're based. And also some workplaces will pay you a partial rate for cancellations, or even sometimes a full rate for cancellations, and some pay you nothing for cancellations. And they have like variable policies too. So sometimes it's a 24-hour cancellation policy, sometimes it's 48 hours, blah, blah, blah. It gets highly, highly complicated. These are by far the most complicated types of contracts. But the point to understand is that you're paid per visit. You're paid for direct time only. However, SLP's jobs is not direct time only. We have a lot of other indirect time that we are required ethically to do. That's simply part of our jobs. And obviously there's going to be natural like cancellations embedded in any SLP work. People don't show, they get sick, all that type of stuff. Okay, so you've got those three different contract types: annual salary, hourly, or pay per visit. And SLPs should think of them in those three categories, just like that. Then layer on top of that, any of these can be 1099 or W-2. I'll describe later what that means. So I want us to think about this in the context of kind of the greater, bigger picture and why we might have these highly variable contract types because other professions don't. So, for example, teachers. Almost all teachers, I don't know the exact statistics on it, but the vast majority of teachers are paid salary, right? So when a teacher goes to look for a job, they're thinking about pay in annual terms. They're thinking, oh, I can expect to make $60,000 a year, or oh, I can expect to make 65, or I hope that by this step on the salary schedule, once I get there, I'm excited to be making 68 or whatever. Engineers in general, like most full-time jobs, like most, newbie SLPs whose parents supported them and sending them off to grad school, wishing them well. They get a degree, then they get a job. Their parents tend to think about jobs this way too. So like new SLPs will tend to have conversations with their family or loved ones about how much they're going to be making per year. And then over time that switches to per hourly once they actually, per hour when they actually get in our field. And these also tend to all be W-2 jobs. Another common norm for certain professions, though, is to be paid either hourly, and it's highly variable, or per unit. So good examples of this would be like DoorDash and Uber drivers. So people who are doing that work, they get paid for every single delivery that they make. So it's not the case that these people are being paid from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. or like noon to 9 p.m. or anything like that. Instead, they tend to be 1099 contractors and they're paid per unit. This is also very common for personal trainers. So like when you see a bunch of personal trainers discussing pay with each other, you'll hear them talk about like their fee for training, and they'll think of it as an hourly term. Like, oh, I charge $50 per hour for training, for example. And they too are basically being paid per unit, or like SLPs who are being paid direct time only, right? Or like construction trade workers. And for these professions, when they discuss pay with each other, like with the personal trainer example, they're almost all paid the same way. It would be more an exception to the rule for a personal trainer to be on a salary, for example. So now come back to SLPs again. So for us to have it be very normal for a lot of us to be on a salary, a lot of us to be on stable hourly contracts, a lot of us to be on variable hourly contracts, and a lot of us to be paid per session or per visit, which is a version of per unit pay. And for us to have at this point almost an even split between 1099 and W-2 workers, what that means for SLPs, and one of the reasons I think all of us are often just confused, and why SLPs, more than other professions, need to pay much closer attention to our contracts and running math on it is because we can't talk to each other about pay. We can't talk to each other about pay and make sense of it if we don't deeply understand how each other is being paid and how we need to make adjustments for it, because that's how you end up getting into a situation where like one person's hourly contract and another person's hourly contract are not comparable. So anytime you see a discussion on social media where somebody says something like, hey, so I'm starting a new job at a private practice in Chicago and they're offering me a $45 per hour contract. Is that good pay? Nobody should be answering that question. Nobody should be answering that question because it can't be answered, because these contracts are like, it could be $45 per hour or $45 per visit. And remember how I talked about how if you're paid per visit, there's tens of thousands of dollars of variability in there that you need to account for. So essentially that question cannot be answered. But it can become answered if we start to ask each other deeper questions, which I'll talk about next. Real quick, though, we need to also clarify what 1099 is and W-2 is. So I think the number one most important thing for people to understand is contract types, like deeply paying attention to how this impacts pay, which we'll run calculations later. And then level 2 is understanding 1099 versus W-2, because there's pay and work differences between these as well. So let's get into 1099 versus W-2 now. So 1099 is really just shorthand for a contractor. Really, the 1099 is actually the tax form that you're issued as a contractor. And then W-2 refers to employee, and W-2 is the tax form that you're issued as an employee. So 1099 W-2 is really just the name of the paperwork you're given. However, I highly, highly, highly encourage people to use the terms 1099 versus W-2 rather than contractor versus employee, because I have encountered many employers and HR professionals and people who are involved in the hiring process who misuse these terms. And like a private practice owner will say things like, oh, I need a new employee. And they'll use the term employee, and the SLP might actually know the difference between contractor and employee. And they're discussing it as though they're going to be their new employee. But then the private practice owner gives them 1099 contractor paperwork. That's what the SLP fills out. And it doesn't matter that they misuse the term employee because the paperwork is 1099. And so therefore they're a contractor. In the eyes of the state and federal government, because that's the paperwork that was issued on their behalf. So use the terms 1099 versus W-2. And then I like to use the analogy, got to move my face out of the way again. I like to use the analogy of houses when we talk about 1099 versus W-2, because I think that it really helps make sense of how different these two jobs are. So using the analogy of a house and assuming that the house is a metaphor for the business. If you are a W-2 employee, you exist within the business. You're part of the business. You're an employee of the business. And in a lot of ways, you're protected by the business. So you're protected by the business with labor laws. And basically any type of employment law will apply to you because you exist inside the business as an employee of the business. However, if you are a 1099 contractor, you don't exist inside the business in that way. You do not have the labor law protections, and instead you are actually a separate business entity that is simply doing business with the business you have a contract with. So notice how in the 1099 image, I created all of these 1099 separate little houses. Because if you are on a 1099 contract, congratulations, you're a business owner. So if you just signed a full-time contract as a 1099 contractor, you need to be thinking of yourself as a business owner. The way you're treated, the way everything runs financially, your write-offs, all of it. And it's basically just like an agreement between two businesses. That's how legally and financially it's treated. So if you decide to be a 1099 contractor, one of the most important things that you're going to have to do is start to understand things like taxes and write-offs, because all of these are going to start applying to you. Now, can a business have both W-2 employees and 1099 contractors? They can, but they're almost never the same role. So it's a huge red flag if an employer says something to you like, oh, some of our SLPs are 1099 and some of them are W-2, and you can choose which one you want to be, because those two roles, if they have SLPs who are both W-2 and 1099, they should have very, very different jobs. Because while it's normal for a business to have contractors and employees, though, like for a given role, like an SLP clinical role, the way they treat their 1099s and W-2s has to be very different. So I'm going to use a house analogy again, because I think that it really helps this set in for people when they're first making sense of it. So let's shift away from SLPs for a moment and imagine a real house. So say you're a person who owns a home and you're wanting to have that home painted. I'm going to go back to the other slide so we can keep these separate looking. You decided that, the paint's chipping off or it's ugly or whatever the case may be, you've got to get your house painted, okay? The person that you hire to paint your house is more than likely going to be a contractor. And that painter, who's a contractor, is going to sign a contract with you with explicit details in it. And the details will basically be like, yes, we agreed to paint the outside of your house. There'll be details about whether or not you provide the paint or they provide the paint. For the most part, they provide all of their own materials. So you wouldn't expect a contractor painter to show up to your house and, for example, be like, hey, so where's the paintbrushes? Where's the ladder? Where's all the stuff I need? Because contractors are their own business. They're supposed to be showing up with their own supplies, providing all their own stuff, right? They also are considered like a separate entity and autonomous, and they get to guide their own work and make their own decisions. So like we'll call the painter Mike, just to make this easy. So when Mike shows up to my house to start painting it, it wouldn't be acceptable for me to go out there and essentially micromanage how he's painting and be like, oh, no, Mike, I need you to do it this way. Mike, I need you to use this kind of paintbrush. Mike, I need you to like start at the top rather than starting from the bottom. And I mean, I could do that, and Mike would probably label me as a very different, difficult person's to paint their house. But like for the most part, the agreement that we have is that Mike is the expert. He knows what he's doing. I do not guide him. I do not dictate him. I am not the boss of him. I don't tell him what to do. He chooses what time to show up in the morning. He chooses what time to leave. And I don't get to be the boss of that unless those terms are written directly into our contract. Okay. So that is what a contractor looks like. It also wouldn't be appropriate for me to give Mike jobs that are outside of the contract that we have. So I can't be like, hey, Mike, I've really been wanting to move this couch from our living room down to the basement. Can you come in and give me a hand? He might be a nice person and be willing to do it, but that is not what I'm paying him for, and it's not part of his job. Just like I also can't be like, hey, Mike, I know you know how to paint. Can you also paint, my daughter's bedroom upstairs? That would be inappropriate because it's not part of the contract. Now, I want you to think about your role as an SLP now. Are you being treated like Mike the painter? Are you being given full autonomy over your schedule, how you work? Are you providing all your own job supplies? Are you essentially coming to provide a service for the business and you're working relatively independently? Okay. That's where things start to get hairy with SLPs. Well, more on SLPs next. Now let's do an example of what it would look like to be a W-2 employee of a household. So let's adjust this story and imagine that I have like a big mansion, okay? And I need a butler or like a house manager that I want to be around and available to me basically all the time. I also want a nanny because let's say, I'm either a busy person or have a job and I have 4 kids and I definitely need a nanny and I have the money to afford it or whatever. The butler and the nanny more than likely are going to be W-2 employees. And the reason is because they have a different type of job. So whether or not it's like a butler or a house manager, we'll call this person George, hopefully I can keep the names straight that I make up. If George is my house manager or butler and comes to our house every single day, he's going to have hours that he shows up. But within those hours that he shows up, there is going to be a job description. Like there's going to be certain things that would be weird to ask George to do. But ultimately, I'm George's boss. So if George shows up one day and I'm like, George, we are, going to clean all the closets today, he's doing it, right? Or if I'm like, George, I have these 3 errands that I want you to run and I need you to run them before you start any of the laundry. He's doing it because I'm his boss and I guide within reasonable parameters what he does. And so how he does it, when he does it, the order he does it, which days he does which things. He is my employee. And so I get to basically tell him what to do. It would also be a lot more appropriate for me to ask George to do kind of like atypical things. Like, remember how I said I couldn't ask Mike the painter to like do extra things that weren't part of his contract? George's contract is looser though, because George's contract is really whatever is needed within the household, within like reasonable, terms within the contract or whatever. So as an SLP, you can be either a W-2 employee of the business or you can be a 1099 contractor. However, you are treated very differently. And if you can't see differences in how you're treated, then you may be misclassified. So let's take an example all the way into like the SLP field. So for example, in the schools can have W-2 employee SLPs who are employed directly by the school district, or they can bring in contractors. They can bring in an SLP who contracts with them directly. So like an individual SLP who has her own private business and she signs contracts with school districts in order to provide services for them. Or the school district can sign a contract with a larger agency, a contracting agency, and maybe that agency has a whole bunch of subcontractors that they basically like assign to the school. Now, the W-2 SLP employee and the 1099 SLP contractor have different jobs. They are treated differently. So for example, if there is a professional learning day, and let's say that there is a really good lecturer coming in to talk about trauma-informed care with everyone, the W-2 SLP can be required to go to that training, even if she already has like tons of trauma-informed care training, and she doesn't want to or see the need or has already attended the class or whatever. She can be required to do that. She can also be required to do things like bus duty and lunch duty and help out with really anything that's part of what the school needs because she's an employee. But a 1099 SLP contractor does not have to do any of those things, okay? So unless it's explicitly stated in their contract that they're going to be doing it, they don't do those things. And also the W-2 SLP employee is much more closely supervised than the 1099 SLP contractor, who is considered entirely independent. Like that 1099 SLP contractor comes into the school to provide the services. They do so autonomously with their own job supplies, entirely independently, just to like serve the number of kids that are on the caseload that are agreed to within their contract, and then they go. Okay. So this is part of why it's important to understand the difference, is because a lot of SLPs are misclassified under the wrong category. Misclassification almost always applies to 1099s who should be classified as W-2, not the other way around. But also, which is the point of today's lecture, 1099 versus W-2 has important pay implications. So let's go to the next slide. We've seen that one. All right, so pay stuff. 1099 contractors. I've already loosely described the like behavioral and relationship differences. There's a lot more online. I would highly recommend reading the IRS website if you'd like to look at that. We also have on our website an article about the difference between 1099 and W-2. So if you go to our career advice section, you can find the 1099 and W-2 article, and it will describe a lot more about behavioral and relationship stuff. But then the third thing that makes the difference between contractors and employees is there's important financial differences. So if you're a 1099 contractor, you'll be paying approximately 7.65% of your annual pay in taxes above and beyond what you'd be responsible for as a W-2. And so this is a pretty big amount. So let's take like a fake SLP salary. So let's say $70,000. And for $70,000, I paused so I could do the math. 7.65% is $5,355. So imagine you were to take the exact same job, but the only difference is if you fill out 1099 or W-2 paperwork, the only difference is your classification. Over $5,000 more dollars are coming out of your pocket as a 1099 simply because of the way that you're classified. Because if you were classified as an employee or W-2, your employer would be legally required to pay those taxes on your behalf. But because you are your own business owner and your own boss, you have to pay your own taxes. And so these are the types of numbers that we have to start paying attention to, because that's equivalent of a really solid annual raise. Like over $5,000 is what a lot of SLPs are often stressing about when they're asking about negotiations and if they can get a raise this year and if they're going to be able to talk their boss into it. But like these are the type of things that we actually have to be like thinking about when we're taking our contracts in the first place. The other financial difference with 1099 contractors is you're responsible for all your own expenses. So you cannot legally be reimbursed for things like travel, job supplies, because you're supposed to be like providing all of that on your own, unless it's explicitly written into your contract as like an additional amount of money on top of the amount you're being paid for travel, for example. You also do not get benefits. So it is illegal to give a 1099 contractor health insurance as part of an employer plan, retirement, so like a 401k plan, stipends. All that stuff puts the employer at risk for being told that they're misclassifying their staff, which they would then have to pay fees for. So you won't get any benefits as a contractor. So if you decide to like sign a 1099 contract, don't then go asking the employer if you can get health insurance, because that doesn't exist with a 1099 contract, okay? Also, most of the time you aren't paid when clients cancel if you're on a 1099 contract, unless it's written into your contract that you would be, or unless your contract is flat rate. Those situations are most common in the schools, but incredibly uncommon in any healthcare setting or private practices. So long story short, even if you don't internalize any of this stuff and it just kind of, like floated out of your brain because I'm dumping a lot of information on you all at once, the most important little detail to memorize is that it is more expensive to you to be a contractor. So your hourly or monthly rate as a contractor should always be higher than W-2. So that's a thing you've got to kind of lock in your brain, that 1099 and W-2 pay are not the same, because tax differences alone are significant, on the order of thousands of dollars, if not more. And so you should always be paid more as a 1099. Now, people will often ask me how much more, but when it comes into like how much more, that's actually like deeper and more involved math. And the truth of the matter is how much more really ranges between about 10% more and 30% more, depending on a ton of other details. But some of those other details are also described in the career advice page in our resource section. So you can read more about that there. But in general, 10 to 30% more you should be paid as a contractor. Then W-2 employee is the job that most people think they're getting, both in terms of like the financial aspects, the behavioral, the relationship aspects. And so if you're a W-2 employee, you're eligible for benefits like health insurance through your employer. You also get labor law protections. Your boss is your boss. So if they tell you to do a thing, you just kind of have to do it as part of your, weekly work or whatever. So that's the difference between 1099 and W-2. All right. So this is kind of the point where some of these concepts start to sink in. And people will be like, okay, I understand that there's different contract types. I understand that I could be paid annually or hourly or per visit. I do understand how that could kind of affect pay a little bit. I also understand that 1099 versus W-2 affect pay. And they start to see the factors fall into place about what types of things in their contracts are going to affect their pay from day one. And then the next thing that always tends to come up is like, okay, cool, got that, but how much should I be making? And this question I see constantly on social media, just everywhere. And it took me a while to understand why. Like, I used to think that it was because people were just kind of like using each other as Google, which sometimes we do. Like, hey, can you give me good advice on this? I should have known better. Like, that was a stupid assumption to make. The truth is that SLPs have to ask each other because there are no good resources to answer this at this point in time. And so I'll kind of describe why that is. And then here's some like de-identified screenshots from social media just to kind of prove the point if any of you aren't heavy SLP social media users, which I am. So anybody else who's on SLP social media all the time, whether or not it's, Instagram or Discord or Facebook or Reddit or whatever, will know intuitively that this is one of the most common questions the SLPs ask. And I took these screenshots all in one day back in January because I was like, how fast can I find these questions if I just log into Facebook? And it was within minutes. I could just find this question over and over and over and over again. So why are SLPs asking this question? Here is an image that I created around that is supposed to represent, sometimes I can't figure out what to do with my face. We'll move me down there. An image that is supposed to represent how deep in the trash can some of these different wage data sources should be buried due to how much confusion they're causing in our field. So you can kind of represent them like this. The top of the trash can, so like maybe put it in the trash, maybe don't, depending on how fussy you are about the data. Basically the best data we have right now that does not have a critical error is ASHA's wage data, okay? As of today, May 27th, which is the day I'm recording this, 2025, it is the best wage data we have available. Side note, at Informed SLP and Informed Jobs, we're actually collecting new wage data because I don't think ASHA's wage data is good enough for what we need, but it's the best we have so far. And I'll describe why in a moment. Second best thing you could do would be to ask fellow SLPs what they should be making. So that's why I kind of feel like embarrassed and ashamed that when I was seeing all these questions on social media, I thought that SLPs were just like using each other when they could have just Googled it or could have just spent some time on the internet. And like, I'm honestly like ashamed that I made that assumption because I should have known that they're doing it because the information doesn't exist. Okay. So because of that, asking fellow SLPs is your best bet, but it has, after the ASHA data or alongside the ASHA data right now. But it has an asterisk by it because it only works if the SLPs that you're asking understand what I'm teaching you today. Otherwise, they can send you the wrong direction. So remember how I talked about the Reddit thread that I saw one time where this SLP was like, I'm poor, I can't afford to pay my bills, I'm making $50 per hour. And other SLPs were like, you just need to get it together. And I was like, what's going on here? And then I started to realize it's because that person is on a really terrible contract type and they don't realize it. And there's a lot of variability with pay per visit contracts. If other SLPs aren't bringing those things up to you when they're talking about wages, like asking fellow SLPs is just a crapshoot because the like information and norms that they're going to give you are going to have about a $50,000 variance, which is not helpful, right? Like when we're asking a question, we're not asking for there to be a $50,000 range around it. So ask fellow SLPs. But through this lecture, you should be informed enough to then know how to talk to other SLPs about wages. That way, when you have conversations with them, you make sure that you're getting the right information out of them and you make sure that they understand what it is you're asking. Okay. All the rest of this wage data can just be thrown in the trash, honestly. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, so the BLS data, has one critical error that makes it really wrong, which I'll teach you in a moment. SLP.careers is a website I see people get wage data from. It's even worse than the BLS. And then salary.com, Glassdoor, Indeed, Google, ChatGPT are so wrong. That also includes wage norms that you'll see on Indeed.com and basically any jobs database that exists. They don't just make one error, they make two critical errors in their wage data that makes it just extremely wrong. So what I'm going to teach you today/tonight is what critical error number 1 looks like so that you can recognize it when you see it. And you'll see it very clearly in the BLS data when I show it to you, and what critical error number 2 looks like, again, so you can recognize it when you see it. And also so that you can explain to fellow SLPs why all of this wage data, other than ASHA's, is trash. All right, so critical error number 1, let's talk about this. So The BLS data, for example, assumes that when they're collecting wage data from SLPs, and the SLP says that they work full time, the BLS assumes that that means that they work January through December, 12 months out of the year. But any SLP who's been in our field a while can probably figure out where we're going with this. Do SLPs all work year round, 12 months out of the year, even if they tell you they're working full time? No. Who doesn't work 12 months out of the year? School-based SLPs, for example. And that's a huge portion of our field. Over 60% of SLPs are school-based SLPs. So that immediately introduces a level of problem in the data set where there's a significant chunk of all full-time SLPs when they report annual wages to you that actually aren't working in June and July. And so it messes up hourly and annual conversions. The other thing that gets messed up isn't just the fact that some SLPs don't work 2 or 3 months out of the year, but also when the BLS collects the data and they say, do you work full time? And they are assuming that's 40 hours per week. The SLP will say, yes, I definitely work full time, 40 hours per week. And imagine that you're an SLP who works at a private practice and you do in fact work 8-hour days, Monday through Friday, not on the weekends. But what if you're on a pay-per-visit contract, which is what most private practice contracts look like these days? Here's what your schedule might actually look like, where you may arrive and go home in accordance with a roughly 40-hour work week, just like someone who's paid on a salary for a 40-hour work week. And maybe on your schedule for that day, these are the kids you have. So you have Jane, Jenny, Jackson, Josh, Jada, Joe, and Jahir. That's who you're planning on seeing for the day. But let's say that Jenny got sick, and so she's off your schedule. You're no longer seeing her. And let's say that Jada's family is on vacation, which is awesome for Jada's family. We love that for them. But for you, the SLP, depending on how your contract is written at that private practice, you might just not get paid when Jada's on vacation, right? So because of how many SLP roles, both in clinical and healthcare settings, are actually paid per visit or paid per session, paid direct time only, those are roughly synonymous. An 8-hour workday, even though you're there 8 hours, you're only paid for certain parts of the day. You might be paid for anywhere between 4 and 7.5 hours on any given day. So the BLS data does not account for this. So they don't account for the 2 months that school-based SLPs don't work. They don't account for the fact that even those of us who are working year-round full-time aren't actually paid for all the hours we work. And the way the BLS collects their data is they ask for your annual or hourly wages. And SLPs, when they report it in, they report the hourly wages that are on their contract because it's what their contract says. Like their contract might say, I'm paid $50 per hour for direct time only. But you can't multiply that $50 times 40 hours per week times 4 weeks in a month and get what you're paid that month. So that's what critical error number 1 is the assumption that everyone in the data set works 20/80 hours per year. So remember how in the very beginning of this lecture, I said this 20/80 number is important because it's everywhere. And as soon as you start to see how many things are multiplied and divided by 20/80 when providing SLP wage data, you'll start to see where it's wrong. So the problem with SLP jobs is this 20/80 rule, that math only works for about a third of us. So anytime you see a salary and then that salary is 20/80 times the hourly, it is going to be wrong, and very misleading for SLPs. So I'm going to pause the video so I can Google the BLS page and I'll show you what this data looks like. I'm going to show you the homepage for the data real quick, just because I can't help it. So the BLS is the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. I didn't say that earlier, but it is powered by economists, many of them with PhDs who work for the federal government. For this reason, it is considered the source of wage data for any field. For most fields, it works out fine, and it's a great source. For our field, it is really wrong. And those of you who are watching this video who've actually been employed for years in our field, I can prove it to you by looking at what the median pay for 2024 looks like. Our median pay is not $95,000 per year. So that's kind of like, funky thing number one, right? But look at what it thinks the hourly pay is. That actually is probably right. It's, in fact, I know what the norms are, so it's very close to right. It's only a smidgen high. But I want you to do the math real quick. What's 4587 times 2080? See how if you get out a calculator, 4587 times 2080 is 95,000. That problem is threaded all throughout the data set, okay? And I'm going to show you what that looks like deeper in their data set. Okay, so if you go deeper into the data set and look at the averages, it from the surface looks like it's so well done. Like it looks like it's done by somebody who knows how to do math, somebody who knows how to run statistics, right? And you can see things like, oh, how convenient. It has the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile. And when we first were starting to build informed jobs, we thought we could use these numbers. In fact, we were planning on using these numbers. And it wasn't until I got into this data set and started to actually plan out how this would work on our website where I had this aha moment where I was like, oh my gosh, it's all wrong. It's all wrong and completely trash. And I feel like you have to see it with your own eyes to believe it. So you'll notice that it's broken up by state and by industry. So like, for example, we have a line with elementary and secondary schools. We have a home health line, for example. And all of these things are really seemingly helpful. They have city level data. So like for any given state, the BLS has like sections of data too that can be broken down by city. And so it seems just so doggone helpful, but it is so doggone wrong. Here's why. So let's look at elementary and secondary schools in the first place. All right. Annual mean wage, $83,720. Now use 2080 and divide this by 2080. It's going to be this number. And I'll do it real quick on my calculator with you and encourage you to do it too, because I swear when you do it, it makes it sink in so much better. So 83,720 divided by 40.25 equals 2080. Now let's use our brains here. Do any elementary SLPs, other than maybe like a teensy tiny fraction, like 2% of them, work 2080 hours per year? They don't work 2080 hours per year because they don't work 40 hours per week, 12 months out of the year. They almost either have 9 or 10 month contracts, which means either this number is wrong or this number is wrong. And that leads the question as to which number is wrong. Now, late last year, I actually reached out to the BLS and asked them about this. And they said that they accept the data as both hourly and annual. So what you can probably assume is that if an SLP is reporting in their data as annual, the annual number is probably closer to what reality is. And if an SLP is reporting in their number as hourly, that's probably closer to what it is. But because every single one of these, the hourly and annual, are all divided by 2080, and because how many of us don't work year round, and because of the very high number of us that are on pay per visit contracts, you cannot use this data to judge your contract. So if you're about to take a direct time only pay per visit contract, you should never, ever, ever be looking at these numbers because you don't know how right or wrong they might be. Now, interestingly, sometimes people don't fully believe me as to how wrong this is because some of these numbers feel right. Like if you scroll down through and if you look at the hourly versus annual, there's certain ones that kind of look right-ish, but it's only the case that they're right when the data is equally right and wrong in a way that when you average it, it somehow makes it pretty close to the actual median. So basically this data is entirely unusable. However, it is what's used in all of our field's research studies. So I've reached out to PhDs in our field who have publications about SLP wages, and they use the BLS data. And what they'll do is they'll use the BLS data and then survey SLPs with what they're making in different settings and whatnot. But none of it applies if you're not on a contract that the 2080 calculation works for, which is most of us. Like I said earlier, only about a third of SLPs are on contracts where that 2080 number can be used to adjust between hourly and annual wages. So that's critical error number one. BLS data is wrong because they use 2080 and they apply it to all the data. All right. What, though, is critical error number two that I had talked about? And that's just more BLS data for you to look at. All right. Critical error number two is when it's assumed that what is stated in a job post is the same as hourly or annual averages. This also happens everywhere on basically any website that post jobs and then use those job posts in order to display wage norms. But let's work through this logically. First of all, out of all of the job posts that are on Indeed, for example, or on LinkedIn, it's not required for everyone to disclose pay in the same way every time. So because there aren't strict requirements around how you disclose pay, that creates a problem. The other problem is because Indeed doesn't allow for any calculation other than the 2080 rule, basically even a well-meaning employer will put their job into Indeed, and maybe it's a pay per visit contract where you're paid $50 per hour for direct time only. So what the employer will do is enter in $50 per hour for direct time only. Indeed will then take that, multiply it times 2080, and assume that that job pays you $104,000 per year. So the job posts are missing lower end data, don't have requirements about how the data goes in. Apply that 2080 calculation to all the jobs within it, and that basically like screws up all the information that's in the job posts in the first place. And you can see this if you're looking for it. So I'll open up Indeed, for example. So I'm going to do this in my own city, Kansas City, because again, it's an average pay city and it makes sense to me, but I would encourage you to do this in your own city for this to really like hit right. So actually, let's do a suburb of Kansas City. Speech language pathologist in Overland Park, Kansas. Let's search for jobs. Now, before we start scrolling down, because some of these jobs are going to be correct and some of them are going to be incorrect, but all of the data that's dumped in, you can see how it's all being coded and represented and categorized by simply looking at this pay drop down. So as you can see, they've got an all salaries section, and they've got a section with 60K and over, 80K and over, 85, 90, 95 plus. Now, anybody who lives in my city and is an SLP knows that these are high. Like, it's pretty difficult to get up to $95,000 plus in our city. But if you start clicking on these, you'll find tons and tons and tons of jobs that are in a lot of these higher pay ranges. And Indeed also thinks that these are appropriate pay bands because it thinks that it's what exists in the database, right? And notice also how it has down here only show jobs with pay information, because again, what I said earlier, some like they don't even have pay requirements consistently. And so sometimes this information doesn't even exist. So when employers are incentivized to only include pay when it's above average, and it's kind of like allowed for it to be misrepresented, where you'll take an hourly wage and multiply it times 2080, and then that's what will display on the website, it basically just messes up all the data, and you can't assume that these are wage norms. And I can prove it to you again by just searching. So what I just searched is average Kansas City SLP wages, and it took me to the Indeed page where it shows the averages. It thinks that in Kansas, our average SLP salary is $115,000. Okay. So highly encourage you to go search it for your own city so you can see just how wrong it is. Again, because everything's being multiplied by 2080 and it's consistently assuming that full-time people work year round. Then you add on top of this the fact that employers are incentivized to withhold disclosing pay anytime pay is below average and basically leaving it out of job posts. And they're also incentivized to list highs that don't represent reality or even the job itself. It's going to mean that all of these jobs are going to be miscalculated and artificially inflated. And this is how SLPs end up with misinformation all over the place. This is why they end up going to each other asking for wage norms, because when you Google it, even from like companies that are very large companies that seem like they shouldn't mess things like this up, it gives you such different numbers that it's just impossible to make sense of it because all of it's wrong and it's all wrong in different ways. And then again, just a side note that like basically every SLP I talk to, and this is how I feel, feels that pay should never be left out of job posts under any circumstance for any reason. And there are many states that have pay transparency laws where it's illegal to leave it out of job posts. And there's also quite a few states with laws in the works. But this information is from mid to late 2024. And who knows what's going to happen with some of these laws over upcoming years. But the point that you can see is that it's not illegal in most states. And so the norm is to leave pay off of job posts. And we see this in our own field all the time. I popped on social media earlier this year and grabbed screenshots because if you go into any Facebook group, the norm is for it to be extremely misleading, where pay just doesn't exist. So companies will disclose that they have a sign-on bonus, but won't disclose what they're paying you. Or job posts will look like this, where it says things like, join us because we have competitive pay and benefits, but then it doesn't tell you what pay is. Like withholding pay is very much the norm. So coming back to pay norms, just know that you can't get pay norms from job posts. You can get some information about pay from job boards, and you can start to collect bits and pieces about what is or isn't normal and what's being offered, but that's not the same thing as pay norms. And in general, the only reliable wage data we have right now is ASHA's. Use the BLS data very cautiously and only if you understand for a given line if it's likely to be high or low and why. And again, that's why we are collecting new wage data. So if you go to our career advice page, you'll find a place where you can share your own wage data and have and consume new norms. As of today, May 2025, we have almost 1,000 data points, but we're planning on ramping this up soon. So I hope that by summer 2025 and late 2025, we'll have enough norm data that it can be used alongside ASHA's and maybe even at some point outpace ASHA's as a reliable resource that doesn't screw up how to represent pay because we actually understand SLP's jobs, right? All right, so here's where we are so far. So we've talked about contract types, we've talked about 1099 versus W-2, we've talked about pay norms and why it's the case that you can't just Google what does an SLP make because it will be wrong, all sorts of wrong. We've talked about how like even in our field science, this data still continues to be wrong because people haven't noticed this problem yet for some reason. And we've talked about why that might be because a lot of times people will feel really uncomfortable with the thought that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is getting it completely wrong. But remember how earlier in this lecture, how I described that in most fields, you tend to have what a normal contract looks like. So like, for example, if teachers were to go use the BLS data, the way they use it is they look at the annual column. They just completely disregard that the hourly column exists because that's not relevant to them because most of them are on annual contracts. So for most professions, it is representative of what they'll make because they know how to look at the data because they're all on similar contracts. That doesn't work for SLPs because compared to most other professions, we have incredibly increasingly complicated contracts and incredibly diverse contracts. That means that we're going to be looking at both the hourly and annual columns. And so it's just the problem that technically exists for for all professionals is just a big problem for us, whereas it's a non-issue for most other professions. Okay, so let's move on to how to calculate pay so that we can choose good jobs and self-advocate because like at this point in the lecture, like we're, 2/3 of the way through, you're probably feeling a sense of like existential dread and like fear and anxiety. And I apologize for that if I have caused those feelings, but these are things that really just need to hit home in a way that we can like move away from them so that we don't continue to like screw ourselves over with not understanding how our own pay works. Going forward and the rest of the lecture, it's all going to be solutions. So I'm going to teach you how to avoid all the problems that I've just described. So we're headed into the good zone now. All right, so how do I know what I'll be paid in my SLP job? So back to this description of contract type again. So remember, you've got to like understand the differences in these contract types so that you know what it is you're looking at. Then, if your contract type is salary or annual flat rate, and if it's like, or if it's like hourly and highly stable, where there's like very few reasons why you're ever paid less than what you're planning on being paid. This math is really easy. Like you basically know what you're going to be making. It's not a mystery what your monthly paycheck is going to be really. And you can also do the math on your own by hand so easily. So like if you have a annual rate, you want to know, are you expected to work 40 hours per week? Maybe the offer is for 30 hours per week. And then you start running the math and realize, oh, because I don't have to, divide it by 40 hours, I can divide it by 30 hours. I'm actually getting paid a little bit more per hour, and this is a good deal, or whatever the case may be. Long story short, the math is easy. Like nobody needs to be taught how to do the math to get from a salary to an hourly rate. And usually you just don't even do that. Like for example, most school-based SLPs who are on an annual salary don't even know what they make per hour because they don't have to do that math because they don't think of their pay that way. However, people on pay per visit or highly variable hourly contracts, they don't think of their pay as annual at all. And that's actually one of the biggest mistakes we're making as a field, is the fact that they think of their pay as hourly, because that's what's written in their contract. So they say, oh, I make 50 per hour, I make 65 per hour. But if per hour is actually per visit, that's not what you make per hour. And when we first started building Informed Jobs database, we thought that through a series of about 12 questions, we'd be able to get from a visit rate to a relatively reliable prediction of annual salary, and it would work. And it didn't work. So the first month of running Informed Jobs database, we actually had to pivot about 4 to 6 weeks in, because we started to realize that no matter how many questions you ask an employer about like their cancellation policy and what's the expectation for indirect time on average, how many hours per week do their staff spend in indirect time, what are the paperwork expectations, like what are the report writing expectations, what are the travel expectations, what are the admin time expectations, are you scheduling yourself, is somebody else scheduling you? As you can see, I could go on and on and on about this, and we started to realize that as we were processing jobs. And once we started to explore alternatives, we realized that there was actually just one question you have to ask. And I'm going to move my face again so you can see the little magic wand I put here, because this honestly is like the magic question. It works better than anything else. So what I would encourage you to ask employers, and this is what we ask of every single employer who posts jobs on our database, it's required, and if they don't give it to us, they can't post, and it's this: what is the average and range of annual pay for this position for SLPs who currently hold the position? Now, the reason this is so much more reliable than anything else is because, remember that slide where I showed you, here, I'm going to go back to it real quick. Remember that slide where I said you can be on a $50 per hour contract and make anything between $40,000 and $104,000 per year? That magic question reveals what that range truly is for a given workplace, just like that, instantly, right? And it's more accurate and works better than us trying to do the math for the employer off of all of these other survey questions. So all you have to do, because you cannot calculate pay for a pay per visit contract without asking about this, because of how like incredibly different practices and clinics are, you just can't know what you're going to make at all without asking this question, period. So the take home, like the big take home, is if you can't tell what you're going to be making per year, if it's not explicitly obvious from the job post, you just have to ask this question. Now, a lot of new grads in particular feel weird about asking this question. Like they feel weird about asking a follow-up question about pay that the employer didn't already offer them. But we have no problems with employers answering this question. Like I said at the very beginning, I'm an employer of SLPs myself, which is one of the reasons I started this jobs database, because I know what it's like to be an employer and I started to see problems. that I kind of wanted to fix, and I knew how to fix a lot of them. And the fact of the matter is employers know this. They have this number, most of them memorized in their head. And if they don't have it memorized in their head, then it takes them 2 seconds to look it up. Why? Because they're running payroll every month, right? And so never, ever, ever will you encounter a workplace where they're like, we don't know what we paid our SLPs last month. We don't know what we pay our SLPs on average. Of course they do. Of course they do. And they need to be disclosing that to you either per month or per year so that you can make sense of what the job offer is. And it's really just a matter of clarity, transparency, and ethics. It's simply fair for an SLP to know what they're getting into. And our field's best employers believe in this deeply, the way I do. And I have no issues with most of them agreeing with doing this. They do it right off the bat. There have been very few employers who we had to block from our database because they refused to disclose this information, because anyone who can see what it would be like from the employee side understands why it's so important. So the response that you're going to get from this, just so you know, because pay-per-visit contracts are by nature much more variable, you're going to get a range. And so what the range might end up being is, this is what it's going to sound like. It's going to be like, okay, so our per visit pay is this. And so your contract will state that you're making this per visit. Here's all the other details that are going to be disclosed in the contract. And then when you ask this question about pay, they're going to say something to you like, well, on average, our SLPs are making between $65,000 and $80,000 per year. That's what most of them make. There is room to make more than that, like if you never, ever, ever get sick and work your tail off, basically. But they'll give you the range in which most of their SLPs make, and you can have a conversation about it. You can be like, what would it look like what would cause me to be at the $65,000 mark if I was trying really hard to get to 80, for example, and just converse with them about it so that you understand what you're getting yourself into. Because for some SLPs, stability really matters a lot. And they might be in a situation where they're saying, I can't take a job, period, where I'm going to be making less than $70,000 per year because I know what I need to be making in order to pay my bills. And or I know what I could be making at other jobs, for example. And so SLPs will often have kind of like a number locked in their brain, whereas other SLPs are okay with the variability in the range. They're like, all right, let's see if I can be one of the ones who's able to make, over $85,000 per year this year in this job. I think I can do that based on what the employer is describing to me. So I refer to it as the magic question, and I put this cheesy little graphic on here because this is the other thing. In addition to locking in your brain that 20/80 calculation, locking in your brain that 1099s should be making more than W-2s and that classification matters, the other thing I want you to lock in your brain is that you should never, ever, ever take a contract where you don't know what you're going to be making annually and where the employer hasn't disclosed that to you. And that also means that as SLPs, when we're discussing pay, we need to stop talking about pay in hourly terms only, because it's far more misleading than talking about pay in annual terms. And we need to get real comfy with describing both when we're talking about jobs. And that's one of the things that we do in the Informed Jobs database is we never have job posts that don't have both. Here's another social media screenshot, as you are learning I love to do. This is a fantastic Facebook group where SLPs talk about wages and companies and everything related to pay. And it's a very high traffic group because this is a really important topic for SLPs and something that consistently confuses all of us for all the reasons I described. And for all the reasons that I described are why I was confused up until I started really actively processing tons of job posts every single day on my own and running the math. But these are the types of questions you'll see. So this is a new CF who is interested in taking a job at a private practice in Detroit. And notice what this job offer looks like. So $40 per half hour session, $70 for evals, $20 for documentation time, $10 for no shows. Then it talks about PTO and paid holidays. It talks about all the benefits. And this person talks about how they've met with the clinic and the office staff, and they really like these people and are interested in taking this job. But they just want additional feedback for a reason I think that they're not even explicitly stating. And the reason is they have no idea what they're about to be paid. And when they ask about this, you'll see that if you were to see the thread, I didn't screenshot the whole thread, just this, but if you were to see the thread, what you would see is a whole bunch of SLPs talking about this contract, kind of based on vibes, kind of based on like, oh, I had a job kind of like this at one point in time and it ended up being good or bad for this reason or that reason. But the core question really is, how much is this SLP going to be making? And again, you can pause the video if you want to and attempt to run the math on this. I can tell you, me and my staff run the math on this stuff all the time. You can't calculate it. You cannot, within a range any tighter than about $25,000, calculate what you're going to be making in this job. You can't calculate it. So what's the magic question that this SLP should really be asking her employer? Back a couple slides. What is the average and range of annual pay for this position? And if the SLP were to ask that, it would provide a lot more clarity, because on the surface, this feels like a really clear job post because there's so many details in it. And it kind of messes with our minds a little bit too, because it has so much information. It's almost like information overload, where you feel like they've already told you so much, so why should you have to ask more? But they're not providing the one thing you need to know, which is what you can expect to make on average and what range you can expect to make in a given year. It's kind of like a fallacy of irrelevance, where even though these details are somewhat relevant, like a little bit, none of them help us actually calculate our pay. So ask the magic question, ask what your annual pay is. Don't discuss pay in hourly, discuss it in annual terms. One other quick story, when the Informed SLP staff was first getting started with planning how we were going to build this jobs database and what we were going to do with it, one of the questions that we initially were kind of grappling with is whether or not we should be leading with pay as hourly or annual, because we knew that we always needed to have both, because that was one of the things really screwing up SLPs understanding their job opportunities. But which one should we lead with? Like, which one's more important? Should one be more primary and then the other secondary? And I was talking in Slack, like an online chat software that we use because all of us work remotely and live all over the US and internationally actually. But and one of the things that we started to get into it about is whether or not pay should be represented as hourly or annual. And one of the staff members in that thread was knew exactly what their hourly pay was. And then I said, well, what are you making per year at your job? Because a lot of our staff are part-time with the Informed SLP, part-time in other positions. And that SLP was like, I have no idea what I make per year. And I was floored, because this is one of the smartest people I know. This person understands statistics. This person reads journal articles. This person translates research for other SLPs, and yet didn't know what she was making per year. But then other people started to chime in too and said, yeah, because my home health job is so variable, I guess I don't think about what I make per year. I just think about what my hourly contract rate is and then just do it. And I think that that's a really bad habit for us to get into, because if we don't know what we're making per year, then frankly, we don't know what we're making at all. And we started to run the calculations together, and a lot of the people at the Informed SLP had just gotten into the habit of never calculating their own pay, because the variability was part of the job, and they kind of just had sort of started to assume in their head that it kind of couldn't be calculated. But even variability within let's say early intervention home health position is still predictable. Every year when cold and flu season comes around and suddenly all your kids are canceled and you're not making any money, that's actually kind of predictable, because about the same thing happens every single year. So we can't even just be paying attention to what our monthly paychecks look like unless we're also kind of averaging that monthly paycheck out over the course of the year. And the reason for that is because it really helps reality set in for how much money we're actually making in a lot of these highly variable pay positions, and allows us to be more informed about what we're choosing versus not. Because I've seen a lot of SLPs who chose not to work a $70,000 a year school district job and instead took a $60 per hour job where they're actually making in the low 60s per year. And so they're making way less, but it takes them years to realize that they're making way less, and they actually would make more money if they went back to the schools. So this is the type of stuff where, it doesn't seem like we should have to do it. It doesn't seem like we should have to do math for our jobs, but it very consistently makes thousands of dollars a difference, and very often makes tens of thousands of dollars a difference. So the big take home is if pay matters for you, don't apply for a job without asking about or attempting to calculate pay. So first, always no exceptions, no matter what. Ask the magic question. Remember, the magic question that I referred to is about annual pay. What's the average and range of annual pay for this position? The only time you should not be asking about that is if the annual pay is already in the job post. Then once you have that, you can start to use a pay calculator in order to make sense of any details. If you're like comparing jobs, like if you're comparing 1099 versus W-2 and that sort of thing. If you're searching for jobs in our database, though, we do all of this math for you. So there, you don't have to ask employers any questions, and you don't have to run any calculations because we do them. And so that was kind of the thing that really started to drive us within Informed Jobs, because initially, we started Informed Jobs simply because we wanted to require pay transparency. That's it. We just wanted a jobs database where like SLPs were actually told what they were going to be making. They were actually told where they were going to work, what setting they were going to work in, because another like quick aside, small issue is a lot of the job posts in our field on all the other jobs databases are actually fake. Like basically contract companies will come in, get you to sign a contract for a certain rate, and then find a job for you. So you don't actually know what setting you're going to work in, what school district you're going to work in, what area of the city you're going to work in, because they secure you at a rate and then shop it around. And so I wanted to avoid that as well. I just thought that transparency matters. And I couldn't imagine any employer who would ever not see the value in establishing trust through transparency from day one by simply telling SLPs what they're going to pay them and telling them basic details about the job, like what city am I going to work in? What setting am I going to work in? Stuff like that. So that is what initially motivated us. But then what it turned into is like, oh my gosh, somebody needs to be doing all this math for SLPs too, because that's where we're really getting messed up. So I'll show you our jobs database just briefly. So right now, the page that I'm showing you is our job database. A couple minor details to disclose. Right now, the website link for this is informedjobs.com. So this is what the Informed Jobs website looks like. But we recently decided, so top secret information that you're learning only if you are watching this video, that we're actually going to move our jobs database in with the rest of the website, because we've noticed that people are getting really confused about where to find this, because our main website is theinformedslp.com. which is here and looks like this. So depending on what month you watch this video, our jobs database might be at theinformedslp.com or at informedjobs.com. We'll set up redirects so that nobody gets lost, but I just wanted to mention that so that this video can last for a year or two without confusing people. But at Informed Jobs, when you click Find a Job and type in, keywords, your location, whatever it is you need, we also have filters that are built just for SLPs. And so you'll see things in here that don't exist in jobs databases that aren't built for SLPs. So if you're looking specifically for acute care or home health jobs, you can click on these and it will narrow to exactly those jobs. And then other things that are highly important to SLPs but don't exist or are relevant for other professions, such as jobs that accept CFs. You'll notice down here that every time I click something, it narrows the numbers. You'll also notice that because we just launched, we don't have bajillions of jobs. We usually only have a couple hundred jobs at a time. And that's normal for us for now as we continue to grow. But anyhow, so You can narrow by like if they accept CFs, or you can look, for example, like if you don't have your Cs, if you're an SLP without your Cs, you can look for jobs where Cs aren't required. But I wanted to, other than showing you the filters, I also wanted to zoom in on the pay thing for you. So you'll notice how all of our jobs have hourly, annual, and informed pay. So these are like anytime it's in dark green at the beginning, and I'll kind of zoom in on this screen a little bit so you can see it better. Anything in dark green is what's in the contract. So like this Aurora, Colorado job, what's written in the contract is 60 to 74 per hour. Within this job post, it'll tell you what would put you at the 60 versus 74 hour range. But like this Virginia job, the annual pay is between 61 and 104. And that annual is what's in the contract. And then these lighter green ones that say hourly or annual estimate are calculations off of hourly or calculations off of annual that our staff is running based on information that the employer provides us. We don't just apply the 20/80 rule like every other jobs database does. We instead, and I'll show you the level of detail that's in here, we instead ask very pointed, specific questions in order to get highly detailed information about like things like whether or not you're paid for all hours and what the median is. And remember that magic question that we ask everybody too, is what their average and range are, so that we can actually determine what your true hourly and annual wages are, rather than it being misleading. And then this third number, which if you hover over it, explains it. Informed pay is a metric that we created in order to be able to convert between W-2 and 1099 without having to do any additional math. So basically it's benchmarked off to 1099 or W-2 rolls and adjusts for the tax implications of 1099, as well as any like standard expenses that would be part of 1099 work. If you wanted to read more about how we do that, you can read about informed pay here. But the intention is that when you're scrolling through our jobs database and looking at jobs, is that you can look at this informed pay line and compare jobs against each other on the basis of pay without having to do any additional math whatsoever to go between hourly and annual, and without having to do any additional math in order to account for the differences between 1099 and W-2. So it's not, I think to some people quite yet like immediately obvious the level of math that we're doing here and how critical a lot of it is for pay transparency. But employers who also care about this and want to exist in a jobs database where like there's no games being played, but instead everything's simply honest, are filling their jobs really quickly and loving it. So lots of information about pay. We also have a lot of quality information that's required to be disclosed, productivity, caseload caps, stuff like that. Some of these are required pieces. Some of them are like only if the employer wants to provide it. So for example, here, let's look at this one. That's a 1099. Let's grab a W-2. Okay, here's a W-2 roll. So anything related to pay is required to be disclosed. Anything related to setting and location. The only things that we allow employers to not disclose are like median pay and range. We don't require that unless we have to have it in order to calculate pay. However, we're finding a lot of employers that when you ask this stuff and encourage it, they will disclose it, and they'll provide lots of really helpful information. Like when I was an SLP, one time I quit a job after 30 days because the schedule was a problem. That job that I quit, I had infant twins at the time. And what they had told me were the hours I would work during when I was interviewed was different than what they ended up wanting me to work. And it simply didn't work with daycare pickup and drop off times. And so I had to quit because what the schedule wasn't clear to me. And so there's little things like this that our entire team at the Informed SLP have gone through and basically said, these are things that an SLP could make it halfway through an interview process and end up bouncing because the employer didn't disclose this information up front in the first place. These are all the type of things that are really make it or break it for SLPs. And so employers should be disclosing them up front. That way they can find good quality fit candidates from the first place or in the first place, so that it doesn't waste anybody's time. It doesn't waste the SLPs or the employer's time. And then any job where productivity would be relevant or where caseload caps would be relevant are also required to be disclosed. We do block jobs. The reasons we block jobs are pay below the 10th percentile. We block those based on our calculations. And a lot of times it doesn't look like it's below the 10th percentile until we actually run the numbers. Then it's like, surprise, you're actually not paying SLPs very well. So we block jobs below the 10th percentile. We block jobs with over 85% productivity. I'll just keep scrolling so you can like browse jobs as I'm talking. And we block jobs where important details aren't disclosed, including like the setting and the location of the job. So while our basic goal is just to connect SLPs with good quality employers who are willing to be clear and transparent in their job post, which we're finding over 80% of employers are more than willing to do that. The bigger goal too is to get better and clearer information about pay for SLPs so that we can no longer be kind of misled and confused about pay, but can start to get savvier about how we're being paid in order to drive up wage norms for the field. And if anything, even if it doesn't drive up wage norms, at least eliminate the crappiest jobs from our field and make it a lot more obvious what good jobs look like, so that I'm no longer seeing Reddit threads with, young single SLPs who literally can't live off of their wages because of super misleading and confusing contracts. So back to the take homes, just very briefly, just remember to pay attention to your contract type because it makes a huge difference in pay, tens of thousands of dollars of difference in pay. Pay attention to 1099 versus W-2 because it matters both for pay and for how you're treated. Keep in mind that most information online about SLP wage norms is wrong, and currently the only accurate information is ASHA's, actually, because they understand SLP's jobs and they don't screw it up. Informed Jobs is collecting new wage norm data that we hope over time you'll be able to use alongside ASHA's. And then going forward, talk about pay in both hourly and annual terms, because the place where we're getting most misled is actually something that we as SLPs have full control over, and that's simply understanding what we're actually being paid. And when we talk about pay with each other and we talk about pay with employers, to never talk about it as only hourly and always talk about it as both hourly and annual. So reach out to us at Informed SLP and Informed Jobs if you have any questions. And I hope that this lecture has been helpful, and I hope to see a lot of really good norms, wage norms in the future. Thanks, everyone.